Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you, Channah, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We are so excited for this. First of all, before we begin, I want to give a special thank you and shout out to Johnny Riaboy, a mutual friend of ours, who gave me a quick text message a few days ago, says we got to get this podcast going. And once I read about your book, I was sold, and I'm very excited to get into the discussion. But before we do, can you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Channah Cohen. I'm from Chicago, the great old Midwest. I've been working for the OU for a bunch of years. And again, a lot of that kind of influenced the writing of this book, which maybe we'll get into a little bit. Maybe we won't. We'll see. I worked for JLIC on a campus at Queens College when I lived in Jersey for a few years. Then I worked for their research department and did like a massive large scale study on the shiddukh crisis, which is always a great conversation starter for any Shabbos meal. You could pretend you worked for the Center for Communal Research if you're low on Shabbos table topics for the shidduch crisis. It's great. And now I actually work for JLIC again. I work for their young professional leadership division called Yavna Young Professionals. So that's kind of like my work experience. And this is my first experience really researching and writing. Recently, I've gotten a lot into history and just the moral lessons that are embedded in the history of the Jewish people. I've become very interested in that, and that's how I got to writing this book in one way or another.
Okay, so just to get right into it, we want to know what inspired you to write a historical fiction novel set during the time of the Maccabees, and how does it connect to the idea of reviving heroes in Jewish culture?
Yeah, okay, so thanks for the perfect question setup. So again, a piece of what inspired me, I feel like I've said this in a lot of kind of different ways, but really what inspired me was I have my oldest is an 11-year-old boy. And as he grows older, I have a 7-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy and a baby now also. And just seeing kind of the media that's available for them in Jewish culture, especially Jewish media, started like grating on me more and more as time went on. And just feeling like, again, especially with the study of history that I was doing on the side, that there are so many great stories available about Jews, for Jews, about Jewish history that are literally epic. They're epic stories of Jewish heroes. And in a certain way, we don't have access to that. Our children don't have access to that, where they do have access to things like Batman and Superman. Like, okay, I remember one time I was at a friend's house on Shabbos afternoon, sitting outside, and I saw her 5-year-old son was playing with a bunch of 5-year-old boys outside, whatever, and a few girls outside. And he was at the top of the slide, and he said to the friends at the bottom, he's like, guys, I'm going to be Batman. And you guys, you're all the bad guys. And like quickly, all the little kids like fell in line with this. And I was sitting there like literally horrified, where I was like, again, I like Batman. I think Batman's actually really good. I think the stories of heroes and superheroes are really important for developing minds, developing young minds in any capacity. My mind too, right? Like they're good for the soul. And I was just like, the kid's name was Yehuda. And I was like, why didn't he say to them, guys, I'm Yehuda HaMaccabee, you're the Greeks, right? Like that's what I want. Like I want us to have an understanding of our own heroes in a way that, like, again, Batman and Superman are great, and I'm not anti them in any capacity, but like we should have access to our own heroes too. And in a certain way, we don't. And I think it's because in a certain way, sometimes we feel like we have sort of this like morally we can't touch them. Morally, they're beyond our ken. Like there's right, like there's all this like hashkafic. Am I allowed to say that kind of thing on over
Sure.
here?
Or
Right, I can. I can be honest. Like right, there's like a
we
hashkafic.
strive for honesty in this podcast. We strive for
Okay,
honesty.
I thought so. I just like felt like I should check before I continue this rant a little bit, right? But like there's a certain hashkafic like philosophy that we shouldn't speak about heroes. And I think it's a little weird because I think that there's no parallel of like a hashkafic feeling like we should talk about heroes and that any developing human needs heroes. So that's like kind of how I got started here, where I'm like, I want my kids growing up to say to each other, guys, I'm Yehuda HaMaccabee, you're the Greeks. Let's play this game, right? Like there's always going to be good and evil. Let's give our own kids, our own heroes that exist that we are scared of, and let's stop being scared of them and let's know their stories. Should I keep going or
You
like
go.
Wait,
Yeah.
wait, wait. I wanted to just clarify something. So when you say that we don't have access to our heroes, so what you I want to clarify as to what you mean by this. So you don't mean meaning we do have
Role
almost
models.
what
Role models.
role models, but in the form of almost like we do have superhero status, okay? Um, and then what you're trying to say is that because they have this superhero status, we can't really talk about them in any real meaningful way that's relatable to us simple people in a way. Is that what you mean?
yeah. Yeah, Bensi, I actually love that you just clarify that, right? Because I think in a lot of ways we do have these larger than life figures in Judaism and in Jewish culture. Every Bible hero, so to speak, is like that, right? Like we don't touch them with a 10-foot pole. I'm not saying we should. If you noticed, I didn't write about the first temple period. I wrote about the second temple period, right? Like I'm also scared of like going there because they were real and like far be it from me to put some narrative of their life um down on paper. But on the other hand, like there's something, a hero isn't someone who is larger than life. Like I actually don't like the term superhero. I think in a certain way, exactly like you said, we have superheroes. We have like biographies and graphic novels and some podcasts like stories for kids in which the elder rabbinic figure is beyond question, beyond fallibility, never makes a mistake, doesn't have a Yetzer Hara, right? And if they make a mistake or they have a Yetzer Hara, it's blacklisted, and like now we're in Chayrim and we have like a massive communal, controversy around it. And that's not heroes. It doesn't compel the developing soul of every human, that like there's some reflection that you see in yourself and in the story in front of you. And in the same way that you feel like the character in the story is struggling with their own dragons, is struggling with their own demons, is falling, is coming out with something new inside of them that then they could offer the world. That struggle and that fall and that coming out with something new, that's the process that really is reflected and should be reflected in the soul of every person reading or hearing or listening to a great story. But to do that, the characters in the story have to not be perfect, and they have to do things that are mistakes, and they have to struggle, and they have to have a hard time, and they have to do something that makes you frustrated with them every once in a while. And we don't have those stories. We don't.
I,
Like we
I
don't
would
tell them.
I would cautiously argue that the Torah itself actually
Yeah.
really follows this line. Have you by any chance ever read Tzvi Grumit's book on Genesis from Magi
No.
Publishing?
Mm-mm.
The entire book is really trying to show that Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and the Imahot and the Shvatim and Yosef, there's a constant struggle to achieve that covenant with God, and it's he goes through all the ups and downs and very close reading to the text. As I'm reading it, as I have been reading it, I've never felt the Torah impact me more than when I've read his book. And I think that we almost create a barrier, you know what I mean? In that everything, and like you said, when it comes to the Torah, it gets a little bit more complicated, of course, right? It's harder to touch that, of course, right? But it's not only just that. It's like you said, it's our rabbis, gedolim, and we have figures of the medieval times, and we're not allowed to kind of peek into their actual human struggles in life because we have to put him on a certain pedestal, and it becomes distance instead of actually getting something from their lives. So I really
I
appreciate
actually
what you have to
think
say.
just to build on that, I think that it's very explicit in Tanakh with David HaMelech that he says himself chatati, right? He says I sinned. But we obviously have a reverence, and the Talmud tries to make us see things in a different from a different point of view, and that's all very, fine and dandy. But the truth is, the approach we have, this reverence that we have, sometimes creates a distance to the point of like not being able to relate. Similar to Lahavdil, but similar to like Christian saints, where they're almost like angels. You can't relate to someone who never sinned, who never really sinned.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to
Of
be that way though. The reverence
course
doesn't
not.
go away from acknowledging her version of what she's saying as a
Exactly.
hero. it's not, it shouldn't lead to any type of lack of reverence. If anything, it gives a more meaningful reverence.
We just had a similar discussion 2 episodes ago, I believe, with Rabbi Gil's student on this exact topic. It's about reverence. So if anybody wants to go back and listen to that, but just to continue about the point you were making, was there anything else you wanted to say on this topic?
Yeah, just I totally hear what both of you are saying. And again, I definitely have inside of me this like push pull with like how far back it could go, right? Like
Sure.
I am scared to touch, so to speak, the Bible heroes, even though I think exactly what you're saying. This isn't a modern approach. You see that the Torah is written in a way that assumes that everybody who's there, who's a model of Judaism for the ages, is also fallible, fights, makes mistakes. We have long arguments for thousands of years about exactly the kinds of mistakes that they make. But the fact that they made mistakes is really on the table for everybody. Like that's for sure. That being said, again, like to answer your original first question, like that's why I went into the Second Temple period. I think that the story of the Hanukkah story is the first proliferated story that is a super clear story of good versus evil, right? The Greeks were not allowing us to serve God and to, to show up in the land of Israel with the people of Israel in the way that the people of Israel should show up. And we fought back with the tiniest resistance against a large, right? Like it's a classic good versus evil story. And even that, we light the Hanukkah candles and we're like, thank you, God, for the miracles of the wars. And we're like, what wars did they fight? What miracles? Who were they? Like nobody even knows, right? So again, like that's why I took that Second Temple period. And again, especially on a Jewish holiday that comes up every year, saying like, here at least is a place where we have to touch it delicately, and I tried to be very delicate in especially Yehuda HaMaccabees character, but here's something that we should know more about. We should be able to relate to it as a classic hero story that's meant to speak to humans, just like every hero story is meant to speak to humans. And like let's learn something from it. Like let's really get to the bottom of what this story is trying to tell us about
Yeah,
ourselves.
yeah, and I think because we don't have
Amazing.
a sefer, we don't have a book or Megillah on Hanukkah, this is a great opportunity for, I think most people don't know the history surrounding Hanukkah, what was happening at the time. So like I think your book is really just coming at such a great time. It's a great opportunity. I think you touched on something that was very much needed. So we're very excited to get more into this.
One other point before we move on. Um, I am actually borrowing this from something you said in a different podcast, but I wanted to just bring it up here because I think it was so important, is that a lot of times when we read these narratives in Torah, in the book of Maccabees, the Megillah, anything, we come from a after the fact standpoint where we don't seem to realize that the people that were involved in the story, right? They don't know how it's going to end. And you can argue this also, by the way, for the Torah as well. Like, Yaakov was scared of Esav, and he says, "Katanti mikol chasadim," like meaning we tend to think like in this like after the fact, and like that they kind of we shape them as if they've also already always known, like we know thousands of years later. And I think that you mentioned in a different podcast how you wanted to make sure that you captured the feelings and the worries and the concerns that your characters in your book are feeling as the Hanukkah story is moving along. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah, I actually love that point, which is as soon as you write a book about the Hashmonaim and about the Hanukkah time period, the number one sort of like ground zero question where it's going to start is that like did Matisyahu and the Maccabim or the Hashmonaim brothers start fighting thinking they were going to win, or did they start fighting thinking they were going to lose? Right? And your whole philosophy of what it would have felt like to show up and actually fight alongside them at the time is going to come down to one of those questions. And again, before I started writing, I spent a long time like reading kind of different sources that went in one direction or another. And I feel like it's a question we all have to ask ourselves. That I love what you're saying, Bensi. Like very, very little time do we ever spend lighting the candles and being like, did Montesquieu really think he was going to win? Like, it's almost impossible to think that he thought he was going to win. On the other hand, like, he had a Muna that was like, head and shoulders above me. So, like, maybe he started knowing that it was the right thing. But, like, I didn't really think so. Again, like, I debated back and forth, and I came out on the side of, like, I'm pretty sure they did this thinking that it was, like, communal suicide, but had to be done. Because, again, like, that's the Jewish tradition. You stand up for what's right, and you don't really worry about what's going to happen to you on the other side of it. But it's really hard to read the story thinking that they thought that they were going to have a successful revolt. And also, like, was the revolt successful? Did it end? Like, did it ever end? Was there ever, like, it gets really dicey when you look at the history beyond the actual lighting of the menorah in the rededication of the temple, which is why the book ends there.
Fantastic. And then that's incredible. Okay. So you've spoken about the shiddukh crisis and the absence of compelling male heroes in Jewish literature. How does your protagonist, Gilad, fill this gap? What impact do you hope his character will have on young male readers?
Okay, I love that question. Thank you so much. I really feel like you did your research, you know? I feel like you understand what I was trying to do here. Again, so what you just did is marry, not to use like a too apropos of a term, but the shiddukh crisis study with this, right? Which is that part of what we found in the shiddukh crisis study on one foot is that it seems to be that men are much more likely to veer left and off of the beaten path of Judaism than are women. And what's happening and why it's happening is a larger scale question that really nobody could answer. But in terms of having done the research, I was the qualitative researcher, so I was the one who listened to the stories again and again and again and again, and sort of really had to hold all of that, the tension around the shiddukh crisis, both for the single people and the people who are trying to help the single people in one way or another. And really, this was like part of the answer that I came up with is like, we have to do a better job speaking to the soul of developing, especially males in Judaism, right? Something social, like some socialization, culturalization piece is off, that like more men are born than women, whatever, demographically, statistically, but then men seem to like disappear somewhere. Where are they going, right? So again, for me, feeling like I had something that I could do about that was very important, that I wasn't just helpless and going to watch the train wreck happen and hope that it wasn't my kids who suffered, but someone else's kids who suffered. Like that wasn't really going to be good enough for me. And this was the place where I felt like I could do something about that by, again, introducing these characters that allowed Jewish, again, especially developing Jewish male minds and souls and characters with models that spoke to them. So I'm going to talk about that in a second, but really like for me, thinking back about the men who, again, it's funny, like the men in my life who I call when I have a question about yashrus, like a question about morality, there are like two of them that are like my go-to. If I'm like, I'm not really sure what to do about this, obviously I ask my husband, and then I have like these two people who I worked with, and both of them are big comic book people. They're both people who were heavily impacted by reading comic books when they were a kid. Like they just have this moral piece of them that has spent a lot of time imagining good and evil and feeling like they're on the side of the good. And it really makes them moral people. I really do feel like that. So I really, again, wanted to do, that's where I felt like I could just do something about that by introducing these heroes. But that being said, again, the main character of the book is not Yehuda HaMaccabee. It's not even any of the five Hashmonai brothers or Matisyahu, even though they are the heroes of the Hanukkah story. But the hero of the story I knew had to be much more fallible than I was okay like making Yehuda HaMaccabee, and had to in some way resonate with these like deep, soulful questions that every developing human kind of goes through in their minds. A big influence for me here, which I have to like kind of give deference to, is Joseph Campbell. He was a mythologist who studied the myths of all cultures and which myths survived in the different cultures. And he basically mapped what he called the hero's journey, right? That every good story, and this was a really a shift that I got from Campbell, every good story is not about something that happens. Sometimes we think that, right? Like I say that this is a historical fiction about the Hanukkah time period. It's not really a historical fiction about the Hanukkah time period. It's really a story about a specific person. And the story is about that person's shift, because that's the part that resonates with the human who's reading it. That's the part that feels like it's speaking to our soul and teaching us a little bit about how we could show up in our own struggles and in our own lives. And the backdrop of that was the Hanukkah story. Right. Again, which is, I'm sort of being tongue in cheek or like just extremist in general, because like that's a little bit my personality. Like obviously it is a historical fiction about the Hanukkah time period. And I was obsessed with making every single detail of the Hanukkah time period true. Right. Every single thing I said to my publisher at some point, I was like, there's not a shred of known history that shows that any part of the book couldn't have happened exactly like I said it happened. And he was like, okay, but that doesn't mean that like it did happen that way. And I was like, okay, fair, right? Like obviously it doesn't mean that like it did happen this way, but like it could have. There is not a shred of known history that directly contradicts anything that I said about any of the characters or anything that happened in this book. And I was like, again, in a certain way obsessed with that. because I wanted the backdrop to be something that the reader could trust. Because if you could fall into a story and trust that the background is real and just sort of like relax into, therefore, just the perspective of the main character, you get to try on this experience of what would it have felt like if I was a Jew not born into the 21st century, but what would it have felt like if I was a young Jew born into 165 BCE, where like there was all of this constraint against my religious life. The stakes of standing up to it were astronomical. There's a tiny little fraction of people who think they're going to fight back. Do I want to fight back? Am I willing to do that? Am I willing to stake my own life? Am I willing to stake the lives of my loved ones and everything that I care about? Because the stakes are really high if you're part of a rebellion and you lose. In the ancient world, it didn't get more gruesome than that. And I'll spare you the actual stories about like the way that they used to kill rebels was worse than the way they used to kill anybody else, right? Like the stakes were very high. What would it have felt like to have to make that choice to fight alongside Yehuda HaMaccabee, to fight for the Jewish people, to fight for the God of the Jews? Like, what would it have felt like? And again, that's what I wanted the reader to sort of be able to experience, which is why it wasn't any of the Hashmonai brothers or Matisyahu, who's the hero. It's this much more fallible, uncertain character who sort of represents anybody who might have had to fight alongside Yehuda HaMaccabee, of which there were many people. My son this morning in carpool, my 11-year-old, was asking me all sorts of questions about the main characters and who was real and who was like historically accurate and who wasn't. And I said to him, I was like, yeah, you're right. Gilad is not historically accurate. Yoezer, I was like, we only actually, interestingly, of the entire backdrop of the Hashmonai and Hanukkah time story, we actually only know the names of 2 other people who fought alongside Yehuda Maccabee, right? There were several hundred to several thousands of them. We only know the names of 2 because they disobeyed Yehuda Maccabee's orders later on and like basically led their guys into a slaughter. Beyond the closing of this book and after the Hanukkah like menorah miracle time period. But I said to my son, I was like, but listen, there were people, right? Like, it's not like there was nobody. It wasn't just the 5 of them. There were a lot of people who fought. And this is the story exactly as it played out between the 5 Hashmonai brothers and the Greeks who they fought. They fought them where, when, and how they fought. And all the story does, all like my book does, is sort of paint how all of that could have happened in a real way. So again, like I'm very compelled by these characters because they're not real, but there were real people. There were. And I want it to be that as you're a reader reading the book, you feel what the choices you would have had to make if you were going to show up in the way that the main character keeps debating showing up in this war against the Greeks.
Fascinating. Very, very interesting.
Really amazing.
So as a self-proclaimed purist, how did you
She kind of described a little
yes,
bit of it,
yes,
but
yes.
okay, we'll
Just
get into a
the
little bit more.
historical accuracy aspect of it, because obviously you have to glean from Josephus and the Book of the Maccabees. So, can you just share the challenges of detailing, the whole historical picture, and how did your historical research reshape your understanding of Hanukkah?
That's a great question. Okay, so exactly like you said earlier, right? Every other Jewish holiday that we encounter or Jewish time period, even fast days, right, that we encounter, for the most part, they have a specific written event that they commemorate, that we can go right back to the source, right? Let's say Pesach, you can go back to Shmos, dozens of prakim about it. You could also have the Haggadah. You have like multiple places that you can hit. You have Divrei, like, right? There's tons of places that you can relook up the history. Hanukkah, we don't have that anywhere. We have like little paltry pieces of Chazal who are not always exactly the way, like they don't seem to want to or care about telling the historical story, which is like Chazal in most places. The same thing with the Korban Bias story. And there's a ton in Sefer HaMaccabim and Josephus. So again, like historically, what I did is that I read all the primary texts, the two books of the Sefer HaMaccabim 1, Sefer HaMaccabim 2, and Josephus on it. I can go a little bit more into detail. I'm not sure like how nerdy you want this conversation to get. So
Dude,
like I
make
don't
it as
have to go into
nerdy.
like
No,
Make it a little
I'd like to
nerdier.
know, yeah.
a little nerdy. Okay, great.
Yeah, a little nerdy.
So there's Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. Maccabees 1 is acclaimed to basically be historically accurate. Any secondary texts that you find talking about the historicity of the time period are going to be quoting primarily from the first book of the Maccabees. It's actually purportedly written probably by a young person who fought alongside Yehuda Maccabee. So that was also part of the inspiration for the character of Gilad. Is like, this is cool. Like all we know about this time period is from like a young guy because again, he survives way beyond all the I think all 5 of the Hashmonai brothers. So again, he must have been young at the onset of it. The second book of the Maccabees is where we have all like the gruesome, gory stories of what was happening, but we also have a lot more like kind of apocryphal, miraculous happenings. So the second book of the Maccabees is like a little bit more colorful and a lot less historically accurate. So no one really quotes that unless you're just trying to add like a little bit of color because it's like interesting. And Josephus, again, who's writing around 150, 200 years after the Hashmonaite time period, Josephus, like any historian, had all the texts available to him, many of which we don't have right now, right? The assumption is that Josephus was not only working off the first, second book of the Maccabees and the lore that had developed since then, but potentially that he had the manuscripts or that he had the texts or the diaries of other people who had fought alongside the Hashmonaim, maybe some of like the royal texts of the time. So again, Josephus, like he gives names to things, he gives details to things that do not show up in the first and second book of the Maccabees, but again, like mostly historically accurate there. So those are the three primary like for like primary sources that I used. And then again, I did a ton of secondary source research and also like seeing who they quote and how they quote. There's a map in the beginning, like any good fantasy or really good story needs to have that, in which the characters move around, needs to have a good map. So like I had to cross-reference. There is no available, it's like bonkers to me. Like there's no available map of Judea at the time of the Hashmonaim. Very often you find maps that have like just the places where Yehuda Maccabee fought battles and like little arrows of like where he went when, right? So like I had to cross-reference 6 different maps and make sure that every time the characters were going in like Google Maps, like how long it would take to walk from one place to another. And again, just like make sure that everyone who was doing stuff, like it would have made sense at the time. So again, like I was, whatever, like snakes that are mentioned, I had to like look up different ancient snakes and texts that had record of what snakes were like in the Middle East at the time. So like, again, I really tried to make it
You even researched guerrilla
accurate,
tactics, no?
What'd you say?
You even researched guerrilla tactics, no?
I did, exactly. Yeah. That was actually that was the hardest piece for me to figure out because it's not clear, right? Like how on earth Yehuda HaMaccabee with really no military experience, I don't know why I said really, Yehuda HaMaccabee with no military experience would have kept alive a few hundred to a few thousand people in the middle of the woods. Like, how do you do that, right? What is the way in which the Maccabim actually could have passed messages to each other and fought back against the Greeks? Like, again, we think it's like kind of magical, but I spent a long time trying to research, like, how would something like this happen? For that, I really took from 2 places. I took from the Vikings. Like I actually researched a lot about the Vikings and how they, again, because they would kind of like come in and do like hit and kills and then like take over villages, right? So like how did the Vikings keep alive like a few thousand troops in different terrain that was not their own? And I researched like resistance movements during World War II, where you had like large groups of people living off in the forest, having to forage and keep and like survive and stay alive. So like between the 2 of those, I had to come up with like some plausible way in which Yehuda Maccabee would have been able to keep alive several hundred people who fought with him, and again pass messages throughout Judea and keep the Jewish villages alive. So thank you for mentioning that because like I think it's kind of cool, right? Like again, this was what I said to my publisher. Like, is this the way that it happened? Like, I don't know, but is this the way it had to happen some way? Like they had to do it. It really happened. So like how did he keep alive? And how did he actually fight back? And how do they pass messages? Like it's got to happen somehow. So like here's a plausible way it could happen.
So how did you find like how did you strike a balance between the older sources, let's say like those primary sources, which didn't highlight the type the story that we have today, which is like the Festival of Lights and the Miracle of Lights and all that,
Yeah.
with the rabbinic kind of the Talmudic uh, version of it? How did you strike a balance between those two?
Yeah, I didn't. I'm gonna be honest with you again, because like you told me I'm allowed to. Like I did not really strike a balance, right? Where what
Nice.
I did was primarily talk about the wars and the history. And the miracle of the lights happens like in the epilogue. It's not even like a chapter. It's like an epilogue. But again, like it knowing and researching the time period and again trying to imagine what it really would have felt like to be there, it's got to be how it actually happened, right? They fought the wars for like 2.5 to 3 years before they came in and rededicated the temple. And again, exactly like you're saying, what you were referring to is the fact that the miracle of the lights does not feature neither in the first nor second book of the Maccabees, nor in Josephus. Josephus has this very weird line where he's like, and we call the festival lights. I'm not really sure why. I guess it's because it was like light in the darkness. And you're like, you're not really sure why? Is it because they found a menorah and lit it and it stayed lit for 8 days? Like, I could tell you why, right? So again, it's like this very disorienting thing that you read if you're a
Yeah.
firm Jew where you're like, what? Like, what? What am I supposed to do with that? So again, I actually, and again, I'm being honest, I don't really care happen to not really care. Like,
Love that.
I think that I love the fact that there was no menorah actually in the temple
Nice.
because it had been sold by a Kohen Gadol who was not even a Kohen like ages ago to Antiochus. So like the Maccabim had to come back and like rebuild with their own hands all the kalim of the Beis Hamikdash. Like I love the image of the menorah at the time being this like wooden thing with like a bunch of metal things that they like lit. Like, did they find the oil? Did it stay lit? Again, my inclination is like, yeah, I love it. Why does Josephus not know? I don't know. But like,
Right.
it doesn't, to me, it doesn't super matter. It's part of our culture. But even at the time, like, let's assume that it had happened. I assume it happened, right? I like it that it happened. It doesn't destroy Hanukkah to me if it
Of
didn't
course.
happen, right? So like, let's assume that it happened. Like, if you were one of the Hashmonaim and you had just, or you were whatever, you were one of the Maccabim, you had fought alongside the Hashmonaim, you'd finally made your way to Jerusalem. You expected a ton of resistance, didn't really get it. You spent 8 days like cleaning everything up. The Maccabim themselves rebuilt the Mizbeach, they rebuilt the menorah, they light it and it stays lit. Like, you're not surprised. I don't think you're
Yeah.
surprised. You're like, yeah, I knew that was going to happen. Like the people in Jerusalem might be surprised, but you literally had just experienced two major scale battles in which Yehuda Maccabee had lost not one man. And you'd been able to actually stand up against the Greek behemoth who had come against you with their top generals. And Yehuda Maccabee, Yehuda Maccabee's general war tactic was a direct target and kill of the general of the Greeks. That was his war tactic across the board. He didn't like putz around. Yehuda Maccabee went straight for the general, the opposing general, and with his own bare hands, with no military experience, took down the top generals of the Greek army again, like 3 times in a row. Like, it's awesome. You fight alongside Yehuda Maccabee, and then you go and you see the candles lit. You're like, yeah, God's here. Like, I get it.
Yeah.
So to me, the only like really open question that bothers me that I don't know the answer to is like, why is if it did happen, if it didn't happen, like why weren't the wars enough for Chazal? Like why didn't they just rest on their laurels and were like, God fought the wars, like let's light the candles for that reason? Like, why does it have to be the miracle of the oil that Chazal is looking at? Like, why weren't the wars enough? Like that question bothers me.
Mhm. I actually love the fact that you focused on that part. Although I do, if I were to, speak for the tradition, it's obviously that they want the story. Sometimes when things get too much about military might, we forget that it's really God running the show. So the highlighting of the miracle, it is a miracle.
Kind of what she said.
Yeah, yeah, rekindling
It's an yeah.
exactly, rekindling the menorah. It's all part of one big theme. But I actually am curious about one thing. I didn't even think about this before, but I'm curious to know because writing a story like this, you mentioned that you had a map, and it just like I started thinking of like Game of Thrones and
Me
all this.
too.
Yeah,
I
it's so
promise
funny.
you, me too.
And I'm thinking to
That's
myself,
so funny.
and I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I wonder who influenced your writing of dialogue. Like how what's your inspiration? Because it's kind of like you're obviously, you grew up in America and you've watched a bunch of shows, I'm sure. So like, is there a particular kind of theme that or style that influenced how you approached writing the dialogue?
That's a great question. I don't know. Like I don't really think so. I could say that the most influential books to me growing up were Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Right? Again, just in this develop like when I was a teenager, I needed the validation and I needed the understanding, like the empathy and the resonance, I think is a word we haven't quite used yet, right? I needed the resonance with someone who was going through something that was a very hard time. I was going through a very hard time at the time. I'm sure all teenagers think that. But just having the heroes who spoke to an element of the human experience that my world was not speaking to. The adults in my world and the my peers in my world were really not they weren't acknowledging the struggles of the inner struggles of every human at the time.
Mhm.
And the fact that Harry Potter especially did really gave me strength to kind of like continue on my own path as a human. So I would say like Harry Potter was the biggest influencer for me. Lord of the Rings, again, just like the epic good versus evil battles I like loved too. I'm not 100% sure where exactly the voice came from, where exactly the style came from. I'm actually, again, I'll be honest again. I'm like hoping this book sells well enough that I could write another one about the Churban bias time period because I
Yeah,
love the Churban bias time period, but also it's weirder. Like you're gonna write a hero narrative, it makes sense to do that about the Hashmonai Hanukkah story and not so much about Churban bias. But I'm having a hard time getting out, like not having my main character sound like Gilad in his head. You know what I mean? Like in a certain way, maybe it's just like my inner voice. Like, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Like definitely one of my friends texted me the other, she's like, who's the narrator? And I'm like, are you asking if he's historically accurate? Or are you asking what part of my psyche he is? I'm like, I'm not sure what your question is. Right. So in the same way, I'm like, I don't really know how to answer that. Like, I don't think I had like one specific influence. I think in a certain way, like, I don't know, all of us, like you sit down and you try to write a story that is in a certain way it's the story that I wish I'd had as a teenager. It's the story that I wish I knew about Hanukkah for all 30 plus years of my life. Like there's a certain like bleeding of my soul onto those pages, and I have absolutely actually no idea where it came from.
But what's the
Weird
reaction you're
answer.
getting? Yeah, what's the reaction you're getting from like your kids and people around you who've read it? Or do you feel like it's resonating and it's something that you can build off of?
Yeah, I really hope so. I do feel like that. I was very nervous to give it to my 11-year-old for a while. He didn't read it because he knew that it would like it's like a little scary for 11-year-olds, I think. Like it's not really like that's the lowest bracket that I'd be comfortable sharing it with. So for a while he was kind of like scared to read it, and then finally we read it together, and I was nervous out of my mind because I'm like, if he doesn't like it, like my ego is crushed, right? And it was kind of like funny this year also, like around Yom Noraim, where I'm like, I am heading into one of the biggest like meaningful accomplishments of my life or the biggest failure of my entire life. Like if I put this out and everyone's like, that was
That's good.
That's
weird. What
scary.
is
I
going on
really
with
felt
you?
that. That's scary.
What'd you say?
No, I'm saying that's a really
Yeah.
scary thing. I felt that.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, like, but for the most part, I think for the most part, I'm getting very positive feedback. Thank the good Lord. And some people get it. It's interesting. Some people like the hero narrative of it that really speaks to this kind of like deeper development. I could tell when they talk to me, when they text me after they've read it, like for some people it hits really deep. And those are the people that are like me. Those are the people who like just something about the hero narrative really gives us courage to be able to like show up in the face of um the outrageous slings of grief and gratitude and love and like pain that the world tends to fling in our direction. Um, and it really helps. It really helps to have again. I learned a lot about this from Joseph Campbell. It really helps to have heroes who, in a certain way, are showing the way. And again, I just want to disclaim that like a lot of that voice is not mine, right? A lot of that voice is history. It's what happened in history. And again, I know we'd like schmoozed about this before we came on, but Hirsch was a huge influencer for me in terms of being able to give some hashkafic direction to the text, right? Like I can't tell you what Hanukkah was about. I can't tell you the moral of the story. Like that is again, far be it for me. I have like ego issues, but not that big ego issues, right? Like I wouldn't go there. I'm scared of that. So I really took a lot of my direction from Rav Hirsch, as I do in general. Um, but a lot of the themes of like, really the moral that I wanted people to walk out with, that was Rav Hirsch's writing on Hanukkah.
We just did a podcast with Rabbi Simi Lerner on Rav Hirsch. You told me that you listened to that, and we're kind of starting to go down the Rav Hirsch rabbit hole. But just for our audience who didn't hear that and don't know about Rav Hirsch, can you kind of explain how you worked him into the narrative?
Yeah. So a few ways. Again, the first is just the direction of just really the moral point that I wanted the whole story to be like kind of circling around, which again, that moral point has to show up not in the history, right? The moral point can't be like God fights for the Jewish people. That's an incredible point to sort of like relive during the Hanukkah time period. But the moral has to be something that the main character is dealing with in his own experience. And again, this is Rav Hirsch. Rav Hirsch says like when you light the Hanukkah candles, you're not thinking like the light in the dark isn't the fact that God fought the wars for the sake of the Jewish people or on behalf of the Jewish people and that God won and that we rededicated the temple. He's like, that's not what the light symbolizes. According to Rav Hirsch, the light symbolizes that there is a light alive in the soul of every Jew that alone, if needed, could save the entire Jewish world. According to Rav Hirsch, fascinatingly, like Yehuda Maccabee is not the hero of the Hanukkah story, and neither is Gilad or Yerezer, right? Like according to Rav Hirsch, the hero of the Hanukkah story is Matisyahu, who was the only person at the time who was willing to stand up for what he felt was right and should be done. And according to Rav Hirsch, that alone, the light in his own chest sparked back alive, the light in the chest of every single other Jew at the time, all the five Hashmona'i brothers, everybody who ended up fighting alongside Yehuda HaMaccabee. Again, Matisyahu dies like 1 year into the war, having no idea where the revolt would go, right? Like he actually is almost like a peripheral a peripheral character to the actual wars that were fought, but he's the hero because he's the one who stood up and started it. And according to Rav Hirsch, like that is the symbolism of the menorah. It's the Jewish spirit that cannot die. Not only that does not die, that cannot die, that is alive in every single person. And again, Rav Hirsch has like all sorts of, that's Rav Hirsch's style. Like he then parallels it to the different halachos at the time and shows that like his ashkafa of what he's saying it means is reflected in all the halachos that you have to follow. So I won't get into like the details of it, but it's very compelling. And that's really like the moral of the story is just like the Jewish spirit and what that means and what that looks like when it's alive in the hearts of all of us, as it always has the potential to be, and that we're responsible towards. And that's what Hanukkah is really teaching us.
So it's not about God fighting our wars, but God's voice within us, inspiring us to fight the war.
Yeah, exactly. And us acknowledging that, us showing that, us letting that take light, us letting that flame grow a little bit brighter. And again, that's what he says. Like, you know, I should have had reproach out here and just been able to like read you the one quote. But he's like, the flame in the heart of one Jewish breast is enough to save the entire Jewish world. Like that's the moral of Hanukkah. And also like when you're lighting the Hanukkah menorah, that means like it could be you. And you should feel like that. You should feel like if it had to be you, it would be you. You have something that alone is enough to save the Jews, just in your own heart.
Maybe Bensi, not me. I don't know. I'm kidding.
That's what you think.
Really beautiful. Really beautiful.
It's a great message. It's a fantastic message, and it's very exciting. You want to just
what do you hope readers take away from your book?
And also tell us maybe a little bit about your ideas for the sequel. That would be
fun. Okay, so what do I hope they take away from the book? Again, there's a few things. The first is just quote unquote this understanding. Like I feel so grateful. I don't know, maybe probably grateful is where it starts and ends. Just with the thought that when people light the Hanukkah candles or when they say Al Hanisim again and again, that they have a little bit of an understanding of like what the wars were that were fought and how hard it would have been to show up and fight those wars, and how the wars were won, which again, according to Rav Hirsch, is by just like the sheer blazing Jewish spirit that was enough to defeat the entire Greek army with the help of God, right? So again, like that just like that moral and that message of understanding a little bit more about the Hanukkah time period and what, again, the challenges that those people faced and the vicarious living, right? Like the vicarious living of like, these are the choices I would have had to make had I lived then. That like Dayenu, that would have been enough. But the truth is, again, there's like that other layer of just, I really hope that the themes that the main character struggles with, which are themes of belonging, they're themes of family, they're themes of trust, right? There's themes of, again, trusting his own self, trusting the social situation that he's in, being able to trust God, that God's going to show up even in these situations where he's really not sure what's going to play out. And either way, he has to be okay, which is, again, a lot of the themes of what Yehuda HaMaccabee talks about in Sefer Maccabim, right? All of that, just kind of like the larger underlying picture of being inspired by the potentially true story of the heroics of what someone else had to go through. And again, heroics doesn't mean like that he wins. It means that he struggles and that he falls. And like, again, the hero's journey of just like the descent into hell is like a huge stage of that, right? Like, and then being able to come out with something new and offer it back to the world, all of that, like that, the deeper level by which really engrossing yourself in the hero narrative of somebody else, and the potential that has to kind of inspire our own journeys in our own ways. That's my dream, right? Is that it will come out as a hero, inspired by the hero and not just by the history.
Incredible.
Thanks, Bensi. Thanks, Ben.
Really, really awesome.
Really, and you've put so much work into it. One can tell from listening to you how much meticulous research, thought, reflection, care that you put into it. So we really, really hope that your book is a success. We hope that the podcast will reach ears and people will buy it. I bought the book. I'm waiting for it to arrive. I'm excited to read it. And we hope that you'll be able to venture off into many projects because we need writers like you in the Jewish world today.
Absolutely. And when I'm going to read Al Hanisim this year, and I'm going to focus on Ve'ala Milchamot, right? The aspect that you're trying to make us focus on, which I love. So thank you again. This was amazing. And can you just tell our audience briefly where they could find you and where they can find your book?
I'm gonna answer. I guess I'll answer in the order that you asked. I actually live under a rock. I happen to live under a rock. I also happen to have a Jewish name that makes me sound like I'm pretending to be somebody else. Like my actual name is Channah Cohen, which like I can't wait till I actually can wait for a long time until I'm at the playground and someone's like, "What's your name?" And I'm like, "Channah Cohen," and she's like, "Me too," and I'm gonna be like, "Okay." But that is my name, so you can't find me anywhere because I live under a rock and I have a generic Jewish name, which is great because then like it has to be about the book and it's never going to be about Channah Cohen who wrote the book because no one's going to ever remember that, which is good for me. So you can't find me really anywhere. It's not true. I do have a podcast. I do have a history podcast,
Oh, okay.
which
You.
is fun, where I talk, it's called Moral Leadership Boot Camp. And it goes through the Second Temple period and the heroes of the Second Temple period, and talks about just like a lesson in moral leadership that you could learn from those people in the Second Temple time period. And like, I'm going to take it either beyond or like shift into another, again, more about the hero's journey, I think is where I'm going there.
So we got to have you
Um,
on again then to discuss maybe something from your podcast. That would be very
What's the
fun.
name of the podcast?
it's called Moral Leadership Boot Camp.
Moral Leadership Boot Camp.
Yeah, and it's about like again just Jewish, like the experience of the actual historic figures, and their choices and what that teaches you about moral leadership from a
That's
Jewish perspective.
amazing.
Amazing. That's
That's amazing.
amazing.
You should be shouting this from the rooftop. This is a great top. This is a amazing podcast. So we would
Thank you.
love to. First of all, we're gonna start listening,
Yeah, I'm gonna listen to it. I
and
think
hopefully we can do this again. That'd be awesome. And then where can we find the book?
So the book is in all Jewish bookstores. It's also on Amazon, but it has like a super long time before it actually ships out, which like I'm a little sad about. And feldheim.com and like all Judaica place. I mean, like any place that carries Jewish books will carry this. So it's in real life and real bookstores. That's the easiest way to find it. Um, and it's also again on Amazon and on those other platforms of the online sales, general sales stuff. You just have to like wait for it to come, which is okay. It's okay. It's okay. Because again, it's like it's about Hanukkah and it's awesome, but it's also just like a great hero narrative for like any day of the year. So I hope that people do buy it and enjoy it. And thank you so much for
No
just
problem.
like gracing me with your time and attention, and really just engaging with the larger meta themes that we've discussed. It's like it's so resonant to find like fellow humans who just care about this kind of thing, and who also just like we're all on the same team. Like we're all compelled by the same kind of like cultural like need to move us as the Jewish people like one step forward. So I really appreciate your time.
Anytime,
of
anytime. It's a
course.
pleasure, and
Pleasure is ours.
we hope to do this again. Thank you so much. Happy
Thanks.
Hanukkah.